So this video is just intended to give you an overview of the SAT in case you aren't very familiar with it. So I'll just cover the content and some general strategies and information that you should know when you're taking the SAT. Okay, so first you should know that the SAT is always offered multiple times throughout the year. So here are the test dates for this coming year, and you typically have to register about a month in advance to avoid the late fee, and it typically costs around $50 to register. For some test dates, you're able to get question and answer service, which means they'll tell you which questions you got wrong, and sometimes they'll even give you your test booklet. That costs $18 extra, and that's really worthwhile if you're going to take another test in close proximity to that test that you're signing up for, because you can learn from the mistakes you made on your past test. So most schools will take your top scores in each of the three sections, the subsections of the test. So those sections are reading and math, which are typically deemed to be the most important, and then the writing section. So for example, if you look at these scores from a student who took the test a ton of times, then you'll see that if you just took the top score in each section, then you'd pick the 800 in reading, the 800 in writing, and the 760 in math. So that student's total score, when you cherry pick the best scores in each subsection, would be 2360. So that's common at most schools. And your score is calculated by taking your raw score, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, and then converting it to your scaled score. So that's what you typically see. That's what you send to colleges. You just send your scaled score. So that's the score out of 800 in each individual section. And the raw score is just the total number of questions you got right minus the number that you got wrong. That'll be times 0.25 or times 1/4. You'll subtract those ones that you got wrong from your total of the ones you got right, and we'll talk about that later. So as you can see, to get 800 in critical reading, you have some room to get some questions wrong. You can get 64 out of 67 questions right and get 800. The math section is much less forgiving. You really can't get any questions wrong to get 800 in math. So there are 54 math questions, and you have to get them all right to get 800. In this, I can see actually you could get 53 right, but that's pretty atypical. Generally, you have to get all of them right to get 800 in math. And then the writing table, it factors in your essay as about a third of your writing score. So that's why they have the writing essay scores along the top there. And then this on the side, on the leftmost column, this is the total that you'd get right for the multiple choice questions. So there's a combination of multiple choice questions and the essay that come together to make up your writing score. And we'll talk more about the content of the sections also. So there's three sections. The writing section is a 25-minute essay, which is always the first part of the test, and you only get one question. There has been some misinformation about this. I've heard from some students that they were advised by other test prep companies that there's more than one question, but you only get the one question and you don't have an option to answer a different question. That's the same with the ACT. The ACT only gives you one question that you can answer. Then the other two sections are multiple choice. So there's a 25-minute correcting errors and identifying errors and improving paragraph section. So all three of those kinds of questions show up in that section, and that's usually in the middle of the test. And then the last section of the test is always a 10-minute writing section that just has correcting errors questions. So we'll look at some examples of those kinds of questions. So here's the kind of essay question you'll get. So you'll notice it's very broad. So the question is the assignment, and this is what you have to respond to. So this question is it important to question the ideas and decisions of people in positions of authority? So you basically just need to argue, yes, it is important to question the ideas and decisions of people in positions of authority, or no, it's not important or valuable to question people in authority. And this quote here is not the question. You have to be really careful that you aren't just responding to the quote, because you're being graded on whether or not you respond thoughtfully to this question. So don't get tripped up and accidentally kind of respond to the quote as if it was the question. So this will always be pretty much the same. What it says after the question, it'll just say, plan and write an essay in which you develop your point of view on this issue and support your position with reasoning and examples taken from your reading, studies, experience, or observations. So you just have to support your essay in a 5-paragraph essay format, and you should try to come up with 3 little anecdotes to support your argument. And you should know that These essays are typically graded almost primarily based on how much you write. The New York Times did a study in which they compared the number of words in students' essays to the scores the students received, and they found that 90% of the time you could grade the essays just based on the number of words. So the essays with more words had higher scores, and the correlation was very significant. Okay, so this is the holistic rubric that 2 graders will be using to grade your essay. So they grade it out of 6. So these are the lower scores, and these are the higher scores. So they're just seeing which of these sets of descriptions best captures your essay. So they basically take 2 to 3 minutes to read the essay, and then they just give it a score based on this rubric. And we'll look at the top 2 scores shortly. So they have 2 graders that grade it independently, and if there's a discrepancy of more than 1 point, then they bring in a third reader, but that only happens about 3% of the time. So it's very rare for the scorers to have very different views of the essay. So let's look at score 6, because this is a perfect essay. So an essay that scores a 6 demonstrates clear and consistent mastery, although it can have some minor errors. And here are some of the components that they're looking for in an essay that gets a 6. So it effectively and insightfully develops a point of view on the issue and demonstrates outstanding critical thinking using clearly appropriate examples, reasons, and other evidence to support its position. So this part is slightly subjective and up to interpretation, but the word insightfully here makes me think that you want to try to avoid the most obvious examples to support your argument. So I have actually gotten a 6 out of 6 from one grader on essays where I've used really common examples to support my argument, like Abraham Lincoln and the women's right to vote movement, those kinds of things. But it's easier to get a score of 6 if you use more obscure references to support your argument. But a lot of you should be shooting for a 5, because you can get a 5 with just using examples from your learning in your history classes and your English classes. So as you can see, there's not really a huge difference between score 6 and score 5. Basically, the big difference is whether or not your evidence is insightful. And that, of course, is somewhat subjective. And then the highest scoring essays are really well organized. So they have a clear introduction that can be very brief. It can be like 3 sentences. I've gotten a 6 out of 6 on essays that had introductions that were just 3 sentences. So, you just want a broad statement narrowing to your thesis. You want to have your thesis be clear and stated in the introduction. And you also want to preview the content of your body paragraphs. And you need a conclusion. The conclusion can be short, and we'll talk about that in the class. And also I have examples of intros and conclusions from essays that scored 5 and 6, and you could check those out. And they want you to use language skillfully. So this means not forcing SAT vocabulary where it's not needed. And they want you to have varied, accurate, and apt vocabulary. So they just want to make sure that you're not just repeating the same word over and over again when you could have found a synonym that would be more appropriate. They also want there to be meaningful variety in sentence structure. So they don't want every single sentence to start with I and then a verb. And that brings me to the point that you can say I in these SAT essays. They don't require that you avoid using I, because you can have personal anecdotes to support your viewpoint, and you don't want to try to make your sentence work without using I, because it often would result in an awkward construction. So it's fine to use I. If you can avoid using I in a sentence that is really just putting forth your viewpoint, that would be ideal because it's implied. But if it is going to save you from writing a really convoluted sentence, then don't shy away from saying I. And then finally, a score of 6 for an essay is free of most errors in grammar, usage, and mechanics. So this requires that you have a certain level of comfort with the rules of grammar, which you'll learn through studying the writing section. You'll learn what concepts they care about. And usage means using words appropriately. Mechanics means things like punctuation and not having run-on sentences and things like that. And I do want to note here that spelling is actually not part of the grading process, so don't worry if you spell something wrong. And I also want to note that if you have a mistake in your essay, I would try to avoid erasing it, because the erasing doesn't come through very well when they scan the essays and send them to the graders. I would cross it out and then write your correction next to it, because that will come through better, and then the reader will be able to understand what you were saying. Okay, so So we'll explore these further in a separate video about the writing section, but I just wanted to give you an overview of how it's graded in this brief introduction. And here are some examples of the sentence corrections and identifying errors questions that you'll see in the writing section. So that last 10-minute section will be all questions like this number 10 here, where you have to read the sentence and then find the appropriate correction among the answer choices. So the first option will always just reiterate what was previously stated in the question. So it's just a repetition. So it's basically saying no change. And then the other remaining answers will have some change that is an attempt to fix the sentence. So you have to pick the correct solution to solving the sentence. So what I do is I read the sentence and then predict what the correction is, and then I look for that correction. And we'll do that in further detail in our writing section video. And then for question like 23, this is identifying the error. So in this question, you read the question and see what's wrong. So often you're going to do this by ear. It'll just sound wrong. And then there's also a ton of rules that we'll cover in some of the videos and in the classes. So you just read the sentence and circle whichever letter indicates what's wrong with the sentence. And E is always no error. So there are usually like 4 no errors in the writing section at most, pretty much. I mean, there was one time that I had 5, but it's very rare. And this is the last kind of question that you'll have in the writing section. So sometimes they'll have, sorry, not sometimes, they'll always have 5 paragraph correction questions, and that will always be at the end of the 25-minute writing section that happens in the middle of the test. So here's an example of the kind of questions they would ask, and it'll always be based on this paragraph. And these directions and all the directions throughout the test will always be the same, so you don't need to read the directions on test day because you'll be familiar with them ahead of time. So then they'll just ask you questions like, which of the following is the best way to combine sentences 6 and 7? So you have to go into the paragraph, and basically, if you are answering this after you have read the whole paragraph, I would go back and read sentence 5 through sentence 8 so you can see which of these answer choices fits into the flow of the paragraph, because you have to take that into consideration. And then there's also questions like this: which of the following would most appropriately be inserted at the beginning of sentence 9? So this is just testing your knowledge of contrast words, transition words. Sometimes they're contrast words, but just transitions between paragraphs and what words would serve as good transitions. Okay, so this is one of the kinds of questions on the reading section, and I'll go back to that in a second. So the reading section always has 19 sentence completion questions, and that's what you see here. So these are essentially vocab questions or analogy questions where they're asking you to figure out which vocabulary term fits in this blank. So you have to understand the logic of the sentence, because you need to determine if the words are going to be kind of synonyms to each other when it's a 2-word question, or if they're going to be opposites to each other. And so much of this is really just a test of vocabulary, so that's why it's really important for you to study vocab, because this makes up about 30% of your critical reading score. And here's another example. And these are the directions, which will always be the same. It just says this sentence has 1 or 2 blanks. Each blank indicates something has been omitted. And beneath the sentence are 5 words or sets of words. Choose the word or set of words that fit best. And with the double blanks, you just have to be really careful that the words function well together. And we'll get practice with that through the class and through some videos. And there'll also be 48 passage-based reading questions. So here's an example of that. So you might have just 1 paragraph and then 2 questions about it. That would be a short passage. They're also long 2-column passages. Usually it's about a column and a half column, actually. There are also paired short passages, so you might get 1 paragraph here and then another paragraph here, and then 4 to 5 questions about those 2 paragraphs. And those passages will be unified by a common topic, but they'll differ slightly in what they're saying. And you'll be asked questions like, what is the viewpoint shared by both passages? So you have to consider what's present in each passage. You also might get asked what view is asserted by passage 1, but not by passage 2. So those can get tricky, and we'll go over some strategies for that. You could also get 2 long passages that are paired together, so they're about a similar topic. And you'll get similar kinds of questions, including both questions. So questions that drop on both passages. And the content is pretty wide ranging. It can cover science. So, string theory and information about planets has been common on the SAT. It could be just an argument asserted by somebody. So maybe that comic books are legitimate pieces of literature, that kind of thing. It can be fiction. So it could be an excerpt from a novel or a play or short story. It could be an anthropological study, so it could just be information about a certain culture, or it can cover history. The topics that they can cover are pretty much endless, but these are some of the most common topics that have been covered. Now I'm just going to go over the math section. So the math section will always have 10 grid-in questions, and it'll look like this, which you have in the lower right corner here. There'll also be 44 multiple choice questions. And the content covers Algebra 1 geometry and the very beginning of Algebra 2, which many of you get to at the end of your Algebra 1 class. It also includes data interpretation, which typically means reading a graph accurately, a bar graph or a pie chart or all kinds of different graphs that you might have. And there are also a lot of number concept questions that require you to think about the qualities and properties of certain numbers like 0 and 1. And the relationships between odd and even numbers and positive and negative numbers. So here are the formulas that you'll be given. So you get the area of a circle, the circumference of a circle, the area of a rectangle, the area of a triangle, the volume of a rectangular solid, the volume of a cylinder, the Pythagorean theorem they give you. So this is for right triangles to figure out the various pieces if you're given 2 out of 3 of the components. And you're also given these special right triangles, the 30, 60, 90 triangle and the 45, 45, 90 triangle. And with this 45, 45, 90 triangle, you also kind of have the equation for a diagonal of a square, because a square is just 2 45, 45, 90 triangles thrown together. So this would be like the diagonal of the square, with the length being the side of the square times root 2. Okay, so here are some of the formulas that you won't be given that you'll want to be familiar with if you want to get a top score. So the distance formula is not given to you on the SAT, and the midpoint formula is not given to you. Slope formula you need to memorize. The equation of a line, y equals mx plus b, you need to memorize. The equation of a circle you don't need to know on the SAT. You will need to know that for the ACT. There's typically a question about that on the ACT. And then you also are not given the areas of parallelograms, rombi, I don't know what the plural of that is, kites or trapezoids, but you could typically just figure those out by breaking them into triangles and squares or rectangles. So one thing I really want you to take away from this video is that for the grid-in section, you aren't going to get points off if you guess an answer. So you can't get any points off for just throwing a number out there as an answer on the grid-in section. And then something else I want you to remember is that all of the answers in the grid-in section can be cleanly gridded in as fractions. So here you can see you have 7/12, which cleanly grids in. If you had like 63 79ths, you can't reduce it as far as I can tell. I've just made that up right now. So it needs to be a cleanly griddable fraction. If it doesn't fit in the box as a fraction, then it's not right. So if you get a decimal answer and you're not sure if it would be a cleanly griddable fraction on most calculators, especially the TI earlier edition calculators, you can convert the decimal to a fraction by hitting the math button and then just hitting enter, which will highlight the frac option, and then that'll tell you what the number is as fraction. Also, if you do that, if you enter in a fraction that's in 2-digit terms, it'll reduce it to its lowest representation, so then you'll know if it's a cleanly griddable fraction. So those tips can help you. They help you figure out if you got the answer right, because if it's a fraction that's not cleanly griddable, then you know you got it wrong. So that's really something to just keep in mind if you're really going for a top score, like over 600. You'll know you're in the grid-in section because the grid-in section is the only 25-minute section that has 18 questions. The other 25-minute section won't have 18 questions. So that's always on the first page. They tell you the time for the section and the number of questions, so you'll know you're in the grid-in. Also, question 9 will be be introduced by this information about the grid-in section. Something else I want to mention here is that question 8 in the grid-in section, which will be on the left-hand side always, right next to this page on the right-hand side of your test booklet. Number 8 is always one of the hardest questions in the whole test because it's the last multiple choice question in the grid-in section. And the order of difficulty in the grid-in section goes easy to difficult for questions 1 through 8. And then at question 9, which is the beginning of the grid-in section, it becomes very easy again. So most of you who are shooting for around 550 and below, you don't want to answer question 8. Give it a look, and if it doesn't make sense to you right away, just skip it, because number 8 is one of the hardest questions on the test, so it's not really worth the time and energy that a lot of people put into it because most students get it wrong. So this is just kind of reiterating that point that the questions go in order of difficulty. Every question has the same value of just +1 point if it's answered correctly, and every question loses 0.25 points if you answer it incorrectly, and there's no addition or subtraction if you omit the question. So you want to plan accordingly, and you want to plan to answer the earlier questions. You know, like question 2 will always be an easy question. Question 16 will typically be a very difficult question. Even in the 20 questions section, number 16 can be tough. So feel comfortable skipping some of the later questions if they don't come to you easily, because those questions are legitimately very difficult, and if you don't understand them, then it's a good thing to skip if you can't get rid of any of the answer choices. And we'll talk a little bit more about skipping a little later. So this is just reiterating how the whole test is scored. So some of you might think, oh, you don't get any points off for skip questions. I just won't answer anything. But you need to answer a certain number of questions to get a good score. And if you want to understand that further, just reference the score conversion chart that I had earlier. So when should you guess? So you should guess if you can get rid of one answer choice. So for example, in this question, if you could just get rid of foreshadow, in the SAT, there would be 5 answer choices. This is not an SAT question, this is just to illustrate a point. So if you got rid of one answer choice, then you'd have 4 left. You'd have a 1 in 4 shot of getting it right. So if you get it right, and even if you had the same approach for the next 3 questions, you'd break even if you got the 3 subsequent questions wrong. So it's good to guess if you can get rid of just one answer choice, so keep that in mind. And this is just a bell curve to show you generally how the scores fall. So this is for all 3 sections. So at the lower end of the spectrum, you'd have 600, which would be getting around 200 in each section. The average, which is at the middle here, is about 1,500, meaning about 500 in each section. And then here, you know, even fewer students, a very small number of students get these scores in the really highest range. And, you know, a small number of students get these scores in the lowest range. So this also just gives some information about what you might expect as far as college acceptances go. So if you score below 1,300, you know, it would be very difficult to get into Harvard. If somebody had straight A's but got 1,500 or, you know, 1,600, they'd have a shot maybe. You just never know really, but these are the general trends. And even, you know, just realize that even some students who do very well on the SAT who get, you know, 2,200 or above can not get into Harvard. You know, it just depends on what the applicant pool is like. So what can you do in light of all this information to improve your score? You know, you might be a second semester junior, first semester senior, trying to figure out what to do to increase your score. So some of the best things you can do are to learn vocabulary for the math section. So one way you could do that is by using a PowerPoint that I made that I have in my SAT Prep Vocab Gmail account called Math Basics. So it just has each math term that has been prominently featured on recent SATs, and it's in alphabetic order. And I tried to also integrate an actual test question from the official study guide for many of them. So you might want to try the question and see how you're able to apply your knowledge of what the term means in the context of the question. You also, of course, have to learn vocabulary for the reading section. So you can do that through my Quizlet flashcards and also through the Gmail resources, which I have info about in the next slide. And then one of the best ways you can prepare is to take full-length practice tests, We should have Kaplan on campus to proctor some full-length practice tests, and that just gives you some added practice with the pace of the test because that is one of the biggest challenges. It is 3 hours and 45 minutes at least, and it honestly typically takes about 4 hours because of the breaks in the test. You get a break almost every 2 sections. That's kind of the average. And if you come take a practice test, then we could talk more about exactly when you'll get the breaks because we do try to mimic the test. Also, you want to make sure you take the test more than once because there is a high degree of variability among the tests, so it's important that you don't just take it one time. And college counseling here recommends that you take it at least once junior year and at least once senior year. Also, I recommend completing math sections on your own and then correcting them in the back of the book and then looking at my YouTube videos for the questions that you don't understand. And then to improve your essays, one of the best ways you can improve is by writing practice essays, but also by reading good essays, because if you read good essays, you'll internalize just the qualities of a good essay, and you'll just pick up on some of the structures and strategies that can be included in a good SAT essay. So here's a page with all the resources that you have available to you that I referenced earlier, and you also can seek me out during extra help. I'm in Woodbury 102, so you come find me, and hopefully we have the same free period. I'm also there during extra help. So good luck with your studying. I hope you feel empowered and a little bit more knowledgeable after watching this video, and please don't hesitate to drop on my assistance. Thanks.